So I am recording this. All right. So let me get back to where it was. So basically, for Harpy Cloud Solutions, we focus on beginners in a different way that we focus on cloud professionals. So, like I said, for beginners, for people who are still trying to find the paths in their career, we look at ways to help them move from where they are to where they want to be. We also do like a consultation where we guide you through the steps that you need to, excel in your path. Then for cloud professionals, like I was saying, if you are a cloud engineer at the moment and you have a project that you're finding difficulties in, we can come in and kind of like guide you through the process, how to, for example, you're trying to set up a Kubernetes project, we can work with you to ensure that you deliver your project on time and with excellence. And, one thing that makes us a standout from others, especially when working with beginners, is we give you, industry-led projects because we also work in the industry. So we give you industry-led projects that helps you have an understanding of what it's going to be like when you start working. And part of our catalog for our program is that at the end, we also help you create a portfolio website where you kind of showcase all that you've done to the employers. And to familiarize yourself with more about Happy Cloud, you can always go to our website at happycloudsolutions.com. All right. So currently we are running an offer there just to help guide people through this part. So for Azure Cloud Fundamentals, this is basically for people who have no idea about the cloud. They don't want to go deep into it right now. Maybe they are project managers or they are just, sales rep in a cloud company and they want to have an idea of what they're selling to their customers. So you want to take the Azure Cloud Fundamentals. The Azure Administrator Associates are for people who want to go deeper into the cloud. Like you want to go for jobs like site reliability engineer, you want to be a cloud solutions architect, or you want to be a cloud support engineer, then you do the Azure Administrator Associate. And the duration for the program lasts for 3 months, but for the Azure Cloud Fundamentals, that takes 1 month. Then the DevOps engineer are people who have an understanding of the cloud already, but they are looking for ways to start automating the processes instead of the, manual ways of doing things like when you deploy from the Azure portal and all that. But for the Azure DevOps, it now goes into using CI/CD pipeline, that's continuous integration and continuous deployment. So these are the programs that are being run at the moment, and the payments can always be done instrumentally. So now what we'll be doing today, and we will be looking at creating a load balance web service using Azure and Azure, AWS, and Terraform. And like I said earlier on, Terraform is something we hope to look at if we have the time, because there's a lot of code that is being involved in using Terraform, and I wouldn't want to get you, confused with all this code. So we'll see how we proceed with this. So first of all, in the Azure environment and AWS environment, they have different terminologies, but as long as you can use one, you'll be a bit conversant with the other one. So it's all the same, framework. It's all the same language. So for example, there's virtual networks for Azure. So virtual network is more like, where your, let's say in your on-premise environment, you have probably set up your servers, your switches, your firewall, and then you start to VLAN your environment and segregate different ports that you use to, assign to different devices. In this scenario, you don't need to do all that because you're not buying servers or switches. It's called virtual because you're taking what already exists from your cloud provider and you're taking a particular address space or address range. We'll go deeper into this as we proceed. So every networking device that you create on Azure has to be on a VNet. And Also, when you're creating servers, it has to be in a subnet. So things like load balancers don't necessarily have to be in a particular subnet, but they have to be within a VNet. So, like I said, the Azure and AWS are a bit similar, but just different names. So VNet is called like VNet in Azure, obviously, and then VPC in AWS. These web servers here are called virtual machines in Azure, and they're called EC2 instances in AWS. So this is the architecture that we'll be working with today, and what we hope to have achieved by the end of this workshop. Just before we proceed, I just wanted to clear up some air. When you tell people, "Oh, I'm a cloud engineer," or "I work in the cloud," they kind of find it, abstract or vague. Like, what do you mean by the cloud? So the cloud is not something abstract. It's not in the sky. It's actually a physical location that is just away from you. So it's basically more like different data centers that have servers, switches, cooling, electricity that you use or that is being outsourced for you to be able to host your environment. There are some big organizations, maybe banks, that don't use public clouds like Azure and AWS because they have this kind of setup in their environment, and they will call that private cloud. All right. So when you talk about the cloud infrastructure, there's public, there's private, and even in the public there are different cloud models like infrastructure as a service, that's IaaS, PaaS, that's platform as a service, and software as a service. But these are the things you get to know when you dive deeper into the cloud. So now we will begin the demo. I would like to start with Azure because I think like Azure is very welcoming, and you will see why I say so when we move from Azure to AWS. When you want to start, like from our diagram, we saw that the first thing we have to do is create a virtual network because your resources have to sit in a virtual network. So you when you enter the portal.azure.com, first of all, you can get a free account. They give you a $200 voucher to use for a period of time. When you exceed $200, then you would have to upgrade your account. And the model they use is a pay-as-you-go model. So if you create a resource today and you delete it before you go to bed, your hourly rates won't be increasing. So like you can actually go almost a year without spending $200 if you're not using it for a production environment, if it's just for learning and testing and development. So now we're going to create a virtual network. I'll just click create virtual network. And your subscription in an environment, you can have different subscription. If this was a production environment, all right, if this was a, Razak, I see your message. I'll put that in the chat. If this was your maybe company, or you had a production environment, let me say for a bank, there's always something called production, staging, development. Before anything goes to production, it should have gone through development and staging. So you see that in most environments, they don't just have one subscription, but they will have a dev subscription. So most people have access to dev subscription, and staging, then production. Production is usually limited. I'm just gonna type in the website for Razak in a minute. Solutions. All right. So, like in a company where I work, we have the production subscription, we have the dev subscription, we have the sandbox. Sandbox is less is less secure than the dev subscription, but the most secure environment is always the prod environment. Then we also have the connectivity subscription. It depends on different organizations. They can decide to segregate their subscription based on the kind of work they do. And in my company, the connectivity subscription is basically used for, you know, housing their firewalls, their switches, sorry, their firewalls, their their networks, their express routes, their circuits. Those things are being housed in the connectivity subscription. But today, because this is a dev environment, we'll just be using the Azure subscription that's made available. Then we select a resource group. So the resource group is more like a container. It's like you have a pattern and then there are different things inside that carton. So the resource group is where all your resources are being stored. So everything that I create today will be sitting in a resource group. And this is what makes Azure different from AWS, because AWS, when you want to create an environment, you necessarily don't put it in a resource group, all right? But in Azure, it's easier to actually, you know, put all your resources in a box. So if you want to delete an environment, you can just delete the resource group and everything in that resource group deletes. Your virtual machine, your load balancer, your storage account, everything deletes. So I've created this resource group. If you were creating a new one, you could just click create new, give it a name, and then okay. So I'm just gonna give this VNet a name. Next, IP addressing. So you can always use the IP address that they give here or give it a different name. Um, in a production environment, and it's important that I always tell you how it's going to be in a production environment, because like it's important that when you leave here, you kind of have a sense of how this would be in in a real life scenario. In a production environment, the way it's done is the network engineer or the cloud engineer creates a networking document where they say these are the IP ranges we use in our organization. So, for example, an organization can decide that they're using 172.21.0.0/16. So that means that every environment that you're going to create will be within that IP range. I can decide that I want another virtual network, and I will probably just give that virtual network 172.22.0.0/16. So now I'm going to create a subnet. The subnet is always derived from a virtual network. So you're just going to see what I mean by that. I'm going to call this web subnet because we're creating a web service today. So see how our virtual network has 172.21.0.0. So this one is going to be 172.21. I can start from .0.0/24. All right. Or I can decide that I want to start from 1 instead. So it is being derived from your virtual network address space. So sometimes, this to go more about, subnetting an IP range will probably be another class, but like how you choose /24 or /23 is just depending on the size of your infrastructure. /24 means you have like a lot of devices that would actually be keyed into your address space. So if you're creating this subnet or this environment for hosting maybe just 3 resources, and over time they won't grow, you can limit this to, let me say, /29, and that would work. So you see how the available IP addresses change. This is 3 plus 5 Azure reserve addresses. So if I change it to 24, you see you have a wider range of 251. I mean, today, since we're not doing much, I could just do like 27/27, and I get, 27 usable IP addresses. All right. So it's always good first. That's why before you get to this stage, we're just doing clicks here. But even before you get to this point, you have your cloud engineer would have done things like, reviewing the environment. What is the environment going to be used for? How many devices and resources are going to be in that environment, things like that. So even down to picking your address range is very important. So now we would select this, choose this as our subnet, and continue. So I'm gonna leave this disabled. The bastion host is basically used when, if this was a, if I want to have like an environment where I would use only private IPs and have no public IP, I will need to have a way to access that environment, and that's what a bastion host is for. It enables you to enter a virtual machine or a server that has a private IP address. So it's either in a production environment, it's either use a bastion host, or you just create, a point to site VPN or a site to site VPN where everybody in that VPN can access your private infrastructure. So right now I'm going to disable this DDoS. I'm going to disable it. So this is basically for DDoS protection. Firewall, I'm going to disable this. Even in a production environment, you necessarily don't have to use this firewall. You can decide to use another firewall, like there's Palo Alto firewall, there's FortiGate, all those firewalls you can use. There's Cisco Meraki. So you don't necessarily have to use this one. As long as you have decided as an organization, this is what I want to use. Okay. You just create it and connect it to your Azure environment. So the next is tagging. Tagging is also important because, like, if you leave the company in the next 2 years, I want to understand what this service was used for. So, for example, I'm going to name this, give it a role, and I'll say it's a web server VNet. All right. And then next is to review and create. So what Azure does is to validate that everything that you've imputed is sufficient to create the environment for you. And when it passes, you just click create. So now what we've been able to do so far, is to create the virtual network and the subnet. The next thing that we're going to do is to create the load balancer and the two virtual machines. These two virtual machines are going to serve as the web servers, as we saw in that image. And the reason why there are two is for high availability. So that means if one goes down, you can always fill over to the other. In different scenarios, you can decide, I want one to be in Australia East, and I want the other server to be in West US. Earlier this week or last week, Azure had an outage in Australia East, and some people's environment went down. This is where a load balancer comes in. If you have load balance your environment and you put one server in Australia East and put the other in West US, whatever happened last week with Azure in Australia East won't have affected you. So one of the reasons Azure gave for the outage earlier this week was a cooling problem for some reasons. So if that was the case and you had a load balancer like we're going to create today, and you're another server in another region, you won't have been affected. So now we're going to see how to do that. So there are two ways to go about this. Is either I come here and I click create Azure virtual machine, or easier, since I'm creating more than one virtual machine, I'm going to use something called a virtual machine skill set. It is basically used when you want to, you have like an environment where it constantly scales. So let me say you're running a promotion, and during that period, your traffic is going to increase. You won't want your server to go down because it's maxing out on capacity. So you want something that automatically scales as the need, requires. So right now, we're going to create a virtual machine skill set that contains two VMs and a load balancer. So again, we choose this web server resource group, and I'll give this name. Like, you can just take note of this because, like, when you get to AWS, you see how the portal and the environment is different from Azure. So this is where you choose your region. Australia East is where I am today, so I'm going to choose Australia East. Someone in the US would choose East US or West US, just depending on where they are. If you're in the UK, you choose UK South. It's just, there are different regions. And what this means when they say something is a region, it just means that they have data centers in different locations. So, for example, let me take Canada. They could have a data center in Toronto and have another data center in Montreal. For America, where they have, West US, East US, it just means that in these locations, yeah, they have West US 2, West US 3. That means there's West US 1, and that means that they have 3 data centers in different locations in West US. So that's what this means basically. So availability zone, I'll just choose 1, and this also kind of like helps you to, helps increase the high availability of infrastructure. So I'll choose standard for this because it's a dev environment. So here you see what is good about virtual environments is if you want to test something in an old operating system that you probably don't have, you don't have to start buying a Windows license or buy a new laptop that has a particular OS. You can just come here, create a virtual machine, and pick the operating system that you want to use. All right. And voila, there's Ubuntu, there's Red Hat, there's Oracle Linux, and there are many more. You just click see all images and you would select that. It's always good to select the latest, which is 2022, because what they do is they have things called end of life, end of support. But since it's the dev environment, I'll just choose 2019. But don't get it twisted. Apart from Azure and AWS, there are other ways to create virtual machines. There are different hypervisor technologies like VMware, Hyper-V. There's VirtualBox by Oracle. There are different ways you can create a virtual machine outside of Azure, AWS, GCP, IBM. All right. So here, we would select a size for our VM. So just as when you buy a laptop, how many cores do you want your laptop to be? How much memory do you want for your laptop? The bigger the memory, the higher the operation that it can handle. If I choose a 1 core 3.5 gig, it'll probably be so slow. But you see, there's a cost to it. As you go up higher, your cost increases. But the good thing is that your bill per hour. So if I create this now and I delete it, I'm not going to be billed this amount because I didn't use it for up to 1 month. So I'm just going to select a username and a password. And this is basically the credentials that you use to log into your server as the administrator. So licensing, I mean, I'm not going to choose this because this is for people who are probably moving from on-premise to the cloud. So that means they already have a Windows license before coming to Azure. So instead of creating a VM with Azure's Windows license, you can bring your own, because what makes your VM price go high is mostly because of the Windows license that comes with that VM. But if you have one, you can actually bring your own by clicking this. But I don't have one. So I will just move to the disks. Encryption and host is what it says encryption. It basically encrypts from your OS to your temporary and cache files and things like that. So for disk, I'm going to choose standard HDD. Depending on your environment, sometimes it has specific technical specifications for building infrastructure. So sometimes it gives you what type of disk is required. I'm not going to attach a new disk because I don't need it. But what this is basically your C drives, D drives, E drives. If you want to have like 4 different drives, just create and attach a new disk. Next, networking. Earlier on, we had created a VNet, so I'll just select that virtual network. So that means my virtual machines will sit inside that virtual network. So the next thing is I'm going to select an Azure load balancer because we need a load balancer to be able to send traffic from one, to be able to distribute traffic between the 2 servers that I'm going to create. So I'll just create a load balancer. and I would say web LB. So there's public and internal. Public is when I want something to be publicly accessible. Like I'm gonna after when I create this, I'm gonna put an IP address on the chat and you'll be able to access it from anywhere. But internal is for like mostly using production environments when I want only people within a particular network to access my service. So here is a port 80. You can always change the port to what you want. So I recently did a deployment where I actually changed my port for my load balancer to 3389 and the boat because I didn't want it to be accessible over your browser. I just wanted the servers to be able to, for users to be able to RDP into the servers and not access it using the URL. But we'll just choose this and create next scaling. Like I said, I'm creating two VMs, so two VMs it is. And next, management. I don't want to monitor because this is not production. Leave all those as it is. And we would review and create. So then we wait for it to create. All right. While this is deploying, does anyone have a question? Do you feel like I'm lost? Why am I here? I don't
Yeah,
get what's happening.
I have a question.
Okay.
So the first step, is it going to be to create a virtual network before virtual machine?
Yes, because every virtual machine has to sit in a virtual network. What the virtual network does is to give it an IP address, an IP range, because that's how your various services are identifiable. So you've probably gone to, let me say, happycloudsolutions.com. The reason there's Happy Cloud Solutions is because there is an IP address behind it. It's probably 20.139.4.3. That's probably the IP address. Every service on the internet has an IP address. But because we know that you can't be cramming 20.139.40.3, it's easier to just know happycloudsolutions.com. So what happens is that we use something called domain name service, where your IP address is being, you know, pointed to a domain name instead of using IP address itself. So it's important that you have a virtual network because from there you generate the IP address that you would use. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So in a situation whereby you create the virtual machine before the virtual network, would anything break, or they'll still be able to reconcile each other?
So you can't create the virtual machine before the virtual network because during the virtual machine creation, you'll be asked to select a VNet. So if you don't have one, if you don't have one, I'm trying to see, let me go to a virtual machine and try to create one and then I'll just show you what I'm talking about. Um let me go to networking tab. So you see here it says create new.
Yeah.
You can't move to it. You see it's in red, so it's a required input, the correct parameter for you to select. You can't click review plus create without selecting a virtual network. So it's either you had created one before now or you create a new one during the process. Does that
Oh,
answer your question?
yeah.
Yeah, so by the way, the stuff we just did just created two virtual machines. And wow, I said WEN server. How didn't I see that? It's supposed to be web server, and I said WEN, but that's okay. We get the point. So now these are the public IP addresses. I see your hands, Razak and Persistence. I'll get to you. These are the IP addresses that will be used to identify these virtual machines. These IP addresses will not be reachable right now. I would have to do something which we'll all see, and you can now access it from your various locations. But before I do that, Razak, what's your question? Razak, you had your hands up.
Um, if
Okay.
my question is not related to the class content. Well, you started recording. So does that mean that we expect to receive the recording after the class? And the next question is, um, do we get the presentation slide or any of the course materials, class materials?
All right, thank you. Good question. So yes, I started recording, and like when this is over, the recordings will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, and an email will be sent out with the YouTube link, so you can watch playback. So for the course materials programs, for you to get access to the course materials and trainings for the trainings, you sharing my screen, I'll just go to Harpy Cloud Solutions website. This is our website, and if you select the programs, you see that we have different programs, and we've been so kind enough to list out the various modules and the programs that are being involved, you know, the various modules that you treat within this program. All right. So with all this, if you decide that you want to move forward, you can click on prices, to check the prices, and then you click on register to register, put in your details and send. And then our team will follow up with you to, gain more understanding of what you want to do. And after the necessary, payments and things are done, we will then proceed with the trainings. That's how it's gonna go. All right.
Understand. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Razak, I saw your hand up.
Yes, sorry. I'm new to the class. So my question is now. So I would like to know the variable API class that is being used. Is there any variable one that is being used? That is number one question. The number two question is like like to know more details about cloud itself, like what it's being used for. So I think you creating like two virtual machines, two server, right? So that I can have a load balancing between the two servers. So I'd like to know more about it.
All right, because you were a bit far, I couldn't hear you, but uh, I guess what you said was you want to learn more about the IP classes. Is that what you said already? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I was saying that what is the preferable IP address class that's being used?
Okay, so the API address class. So for that one, I used 172.21. So that's a class B. All right. So there are different classes. There's A, B, and as it continues to increase, there's also C, D, and stuff like that. But because this is not a networking class, we don't want to go deep into that. There are different, IP address classes where you start from 10.0 does this, does that. There's 172.21 does this. There's 192.168. So all those are different, classes range that you can use. But that's kind of like a divergence from like the, agenda for today. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. I get it.
All right. That's great. All right. So to proceed, we see that we've created the two web servers, even though I spelled it wrongly, but yeah, web servers. And then if we go to load balancers, we'll see that I have also created one load balancer. So now let's go to the web servers to configure this so we can actually be able to access it. So I'm going to go to the web server that was created. We see that it has a public IP address. We need that because we're doing a web server, something that's going to be accessible. We're doing a web service. Then there's the private IP address. Now, something that's very important is the network security groups. This allows this basically controls how you access this environment. So for example, if I wanted to access this resource now, it's going to fail because I haven't created a rule that allows me to access it on a particular port. So if I select this, an RDP file, download the RDP file, try to open it, it's gonna throw an error because a port is not open yet. So I click connect. It's trying to open on 3389, but if you look at the network security group that was displayed, the port isn't open, so it's not going to work. It's going to fail. And it's very important. And this is also ways that you can restrict people to your environment. So let's do this. I'm go back to networking. I'm going to add an inbound row. So source, I'm saying any because this is a dev, like the development environment. But I mean, in an actual industry company project, you won't open it to any because that's dangerous. You want to open it to a particular IP address range. Okay. Right now, I can just open it to my own IP address. So it just takes the IP address of my laptop. All right. But right now, I'm just going to open it to any. Okay. And I'm going to say the port that I want is RDP. So RDP is a remote desktop protocol on 3389. And what it does is enables you to enter into the VM and then do some management on it. So let's get to it quickly. All right. So they both share the same network security group, so I didn't have to come and change it here. So I'm just going to do what I did again, and it would work this time around. Okay. So when you click it, this is what it shows when it's going to work. So I'm just gonna, if you remember, we created some credentials in the beginning. So I will use those credentials to log in. And we're connecting. And now we are in. So this basically is a fresh virtual machine. You could call it a fresh new system that you just bought and you want to use it for, games, projects, whatever you want. So while this is loading and booting up, I'm going to open the other one. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and enable the IIS role that's which enables us to have like a web service. So for Windows, it's an IIS service. For Linux is Apache or Nginx. So let's connect to this. Download. I think I already downloaded this one. That's the one. Yeah. Okay. This is the one that I want. All right. The truth is, I don't need to download the RDP file. I can actually, without downloading the RDP file, I can just open remote desktop on my system and type in the public IP address, and voila, I should be able to get in. So you necessarily don't need the RDP file, basically. So let's do this. Oh. All right. So now we have two virtual machines opened. Let's go to the first one. All right. So I want to enable the IIS role, which allows me to, set up a web service. So I'll just click on man. Okay, how did I get here in the first place? So let me say this is your environment, okay? And you need to start doing, configuring your system. You just go and search for server manager, right? Server manager, and it gives you this on the screen, and next thing you do is add roles and features. So what I'm interested in adding is an IIS role, as I said. So here it is, web service, this one. Done. Next, 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 install. So while this is doing, I'll go to the other one. Next. All right, so we're just gonna wait for that to be done installing. When that is done installing, we can now access the web service on anywhere. And that would ask us to go check it out when it's done.
Do we do this when we're setting up our cloud for SaaS, PaaS, or IaaS?
All right, so for platform as a service, what happens is, so for people that don't know what PaaS is platform as a service, SaaS is software as a service. Then there's infrastructure as a service, which is IaaS. IaaS, that's what I call it. So infrastructure as a service is just what we did now. I basically had to go create the virtual networks, choose an operating system, stuff like that. But for the PaaS service, you get something like, there's something in Azure called a web app, all right, or an app service. Is another way for you to create a web service without using this format. So you don't have to do all this. You just use the app service and deploy the web app that you want. Either you're using Node.js to deploy your project or you're using .NET. So that's the PaaS. Then the SaaS is basically software as a service, and is when you're using things like Dynamics 365, Salesforce, that's already been deployed for you and configured. All you need to do is just to you know log into the environment or subscribe, create a subscription for that SaaS service, and you begin to use it.
Okay, so what we just did now is infrastructure as a service.
Infrastructure as a service, yes.
And
It's always good to start with like the the beginning, so you don't jump from nowhere to middle, like, so you have an understanding and grow with it. So by the time you understand the IaaS, then you start to create platform as a service, because platform as a service for Azure, they usually is mostly managed instances, managed environment. Like if you're creating an SQL DB, those ones are PaaS services and they are managed instances. So in that like scenario, you don't do much, and it's always, so like if I was doing an SQL DB right now for infrastructure as a service, what I'll do is this same thing, and then I'll go in and install all the necessary, you know, OSs or tools to configure my SQL environment. Before the SQL DB, that is a managed instance, which is PaaS, you don't have to do all that. So this is done. Let me look at the other one.
Sorry, I want to ask a question. So what we did now, let me say, like we can create like more than two virtual machines, and we can give the password to the user to actually log into the machine and make use of the machine. All right.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Right. So now we have installed the web service. All right. So now anybody from wherever you are, you can just copy this, take note of this IP address, 20.213.62.156. Whether you're on your phone, anything, just put it on your browser. Like instead of putting a domain name, just put in the IP address and click enter. It should take you to this here. I always like putting HTTP because they always give me HTTPS and it's not configured for that. Now this is what we've done. We've created a web service. If this is where you start from when you want to create a website. Like you can now um go into your IIS service, which is, let me see, in your environment. Let me close this. And you, not from there, you go in from here, IIS manager. Then like you can now start, configuring your files or how it's going to connect to the environment, upload your public.html file in your C drive and just, walk up from there. So that's how you basically see web services. So right now, there are different web hosting platforms like Hostinga, GoDaddy, people like that. They use an underlying platform which uses, technologies like this. So it's either you're using those people or you're actually creating those technologies for yourself in a company, like in a company scenario, they won't mostly won't be using say Hostinga as their web hosting platform. They will be using Azure and for their hosting platforms, because it's more like for enterprises, they have like an enterprise agreement. So when you're working with Azure, there are different plans. Either you're using an enterprise agreement or you're just tied up to a CSP that already has an enterprise agreement. But that's a story for another day. So, anyways, you see how we were able to access these two VMs using their public IP. If I do this also, you can access it. But I don't want, if I was doing a web service, I don't want people to be accessing it by the individual public IPs. Okay, I want people to be accessing it with the load balancer IP. But not necessarily the load balancer IP, but the domain name that I would give the load balancer. So for my domain name service, for example, happycloudsolutions.com, I'm going to tie it to my load balancer's IP address and not my virtual machine's IP address. So if you come to your load balancer and go to front end IP configuration, this is the IP that I want because it it has the two VMs at its back end pool. It has web server 1 and web server 2. Okay, so if one is down, it's going to fill over to the other one. But if my domain name service was just pointing to only one VM, if it's down, it cannot load balance to the other. So now we've seen this with this IP, but what I actually want is to be able to access it with this IP address. And voila, you get the same thing. If one of the virtual machine is down, for example, let me go switch off one of the virtual machines. It would just spill over to the other one, not delete. Stop this virtual machine. By the way, like I have actually like I've actually deleted a VM by mistake, and that would teach you to always one take a backup of your environment, two use locks, so like you can create something called a deletion lock to ensure that you don't mistakenly delete your environment. So if I click delete, it's gonna say this resource is locked, you can't delete it. So I'm never gonna have that kind of experience again in my life. Yeah, so now this is turning off, refresh. So this is stopped. And if I go back to, this is the load balancer IP, it's still going to work because it's going to be looking at one of them. So let's see, if I go to the load balancer and I check on the back end pool, you see that this one is stopped. So that means this is the only one that it's actually, presenting or showcasing to users. I don't know, was anyone able to access this from, you should be able to from
Yep.
wherever you are. All right, that's great. So,
Yes.
all right, great. So now we are done with the one for Azure. And you see how I was kind of like explaining a lot in Azure. So just so you have an understanding of it, by the time we get to AWS, there will be limited time. So I would not, things I would not do when I get to the AWS environment is I'm not going to go into the VMs and enable IIS because it's basically a repetition of what we just did. All right. So I'm not going to do that. I would just create the environment, but not log into it. Depends on time because I also want to show you guys, how using Terraform looks like. So let me say you're done, your dev environment. You can decide to go to your resource group and delete. Just click this and delete everything in it. You can decide to do that. But right now, we would move forward to AWS. But just before we move to AWS, does anyone have any question about Azure?
Yeah, when you say once we're done and want to delete, let's assume we delete in less than 1 hour. Are we still going to be built for that 50 minutes?
No, you won't. You'll just be you'll be built for, if this was for just 30 minutes it was running for, you'll be built for just 30 minutes. You won't be built for an hour.
I see.
So that's why it's a pay as you go model. So that's what they call it. They call it a pay as you go model. But then in production environments where you know that these services are, required for your company turnover, there's also something called reserved instances where they can actually give you a discount for reserving your instance for a long amount of time. So you don't just go and delete it like that. You reserve your instance for 1 year, 3 years. If you reserve for 3 years, you get a higher percentage of discount. That's a different scenario. So here is okay.
When you were deleting, you went to, where did you go to before you delete? All resources or what? For
Yeah,
the
so
Azure.
basically you can delete individual. Like you can decide to say, I want to delete just this virtual machine. And I go to this virtual machine and I click delete.
Okay, that's one.
That's one. Two, you can, if you want to delete everything in a resource group, and that's the container that holds everything you just created, you just go to resource group, select everything, and click on delete.
All right.
All right. So we move over to AWS. You can see the AWS interface is already a bit different from Azure. It can be confusing if you don't have an understanding of AWS. So if you remember in Azure, when we're creating a resource, we could select a region. We could select Australia East, we could select West US. But in this scenario, you don't do it that way. You select your region from here. So whatever region you select here is what you're going to use in all your deployments. So because I'm in Australia, I'm selecting Sydney because it's closest to me. And you always want to use the region closest to you or the region closest to the people that are using the service. If I'm deploying a web service for people in South Korea, I wouldn't choose Sydney. I'll choose a region close to South Korea, and that's what I'm going to go with. If I'm deploying to people, I want people in America to use my service, I'll use one of these, US East, Ohio, just depending on what it is. So it's important because it helps with reduce latency. Okay. All right. So
So
that
for
means
global users, what region would you now pick?
so for global users, you have to now talk about first of all, select who are those users. Let me America, US, Australia, Nigeria. You can now decide, okay, I'm going to host it in Australia East. Okay. And another thing you can do, and that's why load balancer is important for production environments, is the way we created 2 web servers. I'll create maybe 3 and then set a load balancing rule that says it should be load balanced based on geographic locations. Okay, so that means I would create different servers in different regions, and the load balancer is going to load balance based on geographic location. So if you want to access it and it sees that you're coming from Canada, it's going to serve you the server that is located in Canada. Do you get?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. So now AWS. So we started with VNets. I went to subnets. I went to load balancer and virtual machines in Azure. So now to start here, we'll start by creating a VPC. VPC is a short term for virtual private cloud, and that's what AWS calls their own version of VNet, which is virtual network. So firstly, I'm going to create a VPC, and I feel like AWS creates things faster than Azure. But don't tell them I said so. So I'll just call it Web VPC. I'll leave the IP range, or I can change another. So the other time I used 172.21. I can decide to use 10.0.0/16. I can decide to use um 192.168.0.0. This is now another class of IP. All right. So number of availability zones, I'll choose 2. Just basically increases your high availability. Availability zones are different data centers in a region. That's what it is. All right. So numbers of public subnets, I'm going to choose 2. I'll put one web service in one subnet and the other in another subnet. So private subnet here, and it should be good to go. Just gonna wait for that to be done creating. All right, it's done. So within this VPC, we have created the VPC itself. We've created subnets, public and private. We've created route tables. The route tables is important to define how your traffic is being passed. So for example, if I had a firewall in my environment and I want to say every traffic coming into my environment is going to have to pass through the firewall, I'm going to set a different route. So let me just click on route table. I'm going to set like a different route that doesn't pass through the internet. So for this one, because I want people from the web to be able to access my environment, I'm going to create a route that goes through an internet gateway. You see, in Azure, we don't have to do all this, but AWS is different. So another important thing you also have to create in AWS is an internet gateway. It enables you to reach out to the internet and also for the internet to reach your resources. So here you have the internet gateway. So another thing that was created was the subnets, 2 private and 2 public. So now we've created the VNet, we've created the VPC, we've created the subnet. The next thing we'll create is the actual web servers, which are called EC2 instances. So I'll just go to that and create an instance. I've noticed AWS can be pretty slow, because I know the Azure environment wasn't as slow as this. So I'm just gonna call this web server 1. Select an operating system. You can see the interface is quite different from Azure. Select the Windows environment you want. If you wanted Ubuntu, you can select from here also. If you wanted a Mac OS, you can select that also. T2 Micro, this still talks about the VM sizes, depending on if you want something small or big. So I'm going to go with medium. So you're not just looking at the names, but you're looking at the cores and the RAM. So this is a 2 virtual cores and 4 gig RAM. So I'm just going to go with that. And a key pair is basically something that helps you enter into your environment. And when we want to enter into that environment, we have to decrypt the password with a key pair. So you see, different from Azure. So I can decide to create a new key pair. That can be done. Let me just create a new key pair. Web server, yes, and create. So it just, when you create it, it download to your system. The next time you want to deploy an environment, you don't have to create another key pair. You can just use the existing one. So next, we edit the environment, the networking part. So we've already created a VNet, so I'll just choose that VPC that we created, which is this one, subnet. Going to enable public IP because I want to use it. Create a security group. I'll call it WebSG. So I feel like this is a bit tricky from Azure. It's not as straightforward. So here you also have to create one for, let me just do custom. Okay, let me do a custom rule. And I want to enable that. Let me not do this now because I want to show you guys a reason why. Let me do it now. So right now, what we've done, in Azure, when we created the VM, we went in and we created an inbound rule, which allowed us to access the ports on port 3389. Here, because I'm using a load balancer, apart from 3389, I also want it to be accessible, over the internet and use port 80. So I could just basically say anywhere, and it does that for me actually. So here you select the size of how much storage you want. I'll just go with 30 gig and launch my instance. All right. We wait. All right, it's done. Waiting for it to load. Why is taking so much time? I'll just go back to instances and I'll launch another one. I don't know why it's taking so long. Let me do something. Let me turn off these virtual machines in case it is using up some memory. All right. So while this is taking its time, does anyone have any question? No questions? All right. do this. I tend to have these problems with AWS. But like if you go to the Azure portal, like you see how responsive it is. But then with AWS, it just takes its time. Let's see. Right. So I'll just select the key pair that we've created just now for the second VM I'm creating. Same process. I'll select a different subnet. Because with AWS, if you want to load balance your web service, it's required that you put them in two different subnets and they also be in two different availability zones. So hence this. So I'll enable this, select existing security group, which you just created, and we should be good to go. All right. So now what we've done so far is we've created a VPC, we've created a subnet, route tables, internet gateway. We've created two EC2 instances, which serves as our web server. And that thing I want to get to quickly before we move to the Terraform one is how to, load balance the environment. In this situation, before you load balance your environment, you have to create something called a target group. So a target group is basically holding the two instances that you just created. So I'm just going to call this WebTG very quickly. Put this in our VPC and create. So this is created. Next thing, I'm going to register those two instances that we just created, which is this and this. So now these are the instances that I want to be load balanced, and I'll save this. So now we've done this. The next is to create a load balancer. All right. So you see how different it is from Azure. That's the whole purpose of this, for you to see how Azure differs from AWS. That's why I'm doing the both. So now I'm just going to create a web LB and select my VPC. So I'm going to select these two because I have my instance sitting in these two landing zones, availability zones. So here and next. I'll use this security group instead. Next. So existing, because we've created this already. Next, and create. So basically, we've now created a load balance, a VPC, a subnet. I think someone took over the presentation. Let me see. All right. So now basically what we've done is we've created a VPC, we've created a subnet, we've created a load balancer, we've created the two web servers inside the VPC, inside the subnet. So now our load balancer can now load balance our web services. So in this scenario, since we've created the load balancer and then we've created the web services, if you wanted to access this web service, like I said, instead of using the IP address of the VM, of the individual VMs, we will just use this domain name service. Like we'll use this domain name for the load balancer and then impute it into our browser. All right. But this is not going to work right now because we have not gone into the virtual machines to enable IIS like we did for the other ones. And because of time, I won't be doing that. I just want to give you guys an overview of Terraform first, so you kind of leave here with another approach to deploying this. So, so with this, you basically, if the two virtual machines had been configured like we configured it for the Azure virtual machine, if we clicked enter, what would happen is you would see a web service like we did for the other time. So just before I move into Terraform, is there any question? Is there anything you'd like to see that you haven't seen yet? Oh, good. All right, great. So I'm just gonna show us this. And I'm not gonna dive deep into this so I don't give some people a headache in case they're like, this is too much code. So this is Terraform. Terraform is an infrastructure as code, should I say, model or technology. So instead of, you see how we went into the Azure portal and we clicked and created. All those things are really not, you know, the way to move forward in this day and age. Because if you were going to create maybe 10 virtual machines and you didn't want them to be in a virtual machine skill set, you're going to create 10 virtual machines. You can easily just do it here using a Terraform, like using your codes on Terraform. I'll get to you shortly, persistence. So what this Terraform code is if we start from the top, we would see it's creating a resource group for us, which is important that we went through the Azure portal. So now we understand what the resource group is to start with. Before I continue, what's your question, please?
Well, what I haven't wondered, I understand that the cloud computing has been using the Terraform, but I have not been able to learn how to make it connected. Oh, I learned it from Google Cloud Computing. And here, my question is to say, how do we use this Terraform, make this Terraform to be used in our cloud computing, how to make it connected or linked?
All right. So firstly, let me say you have this code, you've already written all your codes, and now you want to connect it to your Azure environment, because how does he know where to deploy to? How does he know, the credentials or the actual Azure environment to go to? So what you do is, I'm just going to open the terminal and you write AZ login. So this is basically going to require you to go into, it's going to open a browser. Just hold on, open in my other screen. Let me just up a screen for you to see. So what happens is it opens up on your browser. So you open up on a different browser for me. So just hold on. Where did I click on? Just hold on. So what it does is it asks you, what has happened now is if you do AZ login, it automatically opens up a browser for you. So this is basically the browser it opens for you, and then you click sign in as this person. Okay, so now you're signed in. If you go back here, you see that it says signed into this subscription. So now you're signed into this Azure subscription, and you're signed in as this user. Do you get? So that's how, first of all, you actually even pointed to the Azure environment. If it was AWS does it differently. You don't need to, you know, go and go through this process. You actually have, for AWS, you create something called like a service principal, where you put the secret and the token inside the code. Okay. So I don't know if this is what you were asking, but this is how you connect it to your Azure Cloud Platform. All right. So Razak said, to someone like me as a newbie in cloud services, what will be my day-to-day activity as a cloud engineer? So for example, as a newbie, obviously the first thing you have to do is to take some trainings, okay? Like I mentioned, Happy Cloud Solutions provides different programs from cloud fundamentals to Azure Administrator Associate to DevOps Engineer. Let me say you've taken these trainings and now you know how to use your Azure environment. You've been able to do some project, because that's things we do. We do industry-led projects within your 3 months um period duration of the program. There you would understand, the things you do in your day-to-day um role as a cloud engineer. And things you do is, one, let me say if it's a new environment, you would start by creating resources. And if you're deploying new resources, you will probably want to use something like Terraform, because it enables you to deploy everything all at once through a code. Okay? Let me say it's already a brownfield environment, and that's you're coming to a company that already has their Azure environment working. Okay? What you'll be doing on a day-to-day basis is, first of all, optimizing the environment to ensure that, you know, the right access is given to people, like they have least privilege roles. Um, to the you're monitoring the environment, no resources down, your services are not down, everything is up and running, you're proactively monitoring the environment. You're creating things like Active Directory single sign-ons. So obviously there's going to be a ticketing system in your organization. People are going to raise tickets and say, oh, I want to integrate this application with Azure AD. Please assign this ticket to someone. You pick up the ticket. And what you're doing is you probably raise a change request to um, create single sign-on for a user. You can also embark on a project in your company, where you have to deploy maybe a FortiGate firewall to your environment, and you want FortiGate firewall to monitor your entire environment. You start from going to, let me say, your Azure environment. Azure has the FortiGate templates in the marketplace. So you can start from there, deploy your FortiGate environment, configure an MPS server, do all the necessary mapping and routings. So there's a lot that goes on depending on whatever organization you join. Whatever organization you join has projects that they are doing. Okay. And your job is basically to contribute as an Azure engineer to that project. Some people can say, oh, they want to do something called a landing zone. Okay. What you do is, what a landing zone is to ensure that an existing or a new environment matches the cloud adoption framework, which means that, you know, you're using the right governance, you're using the right connectivity. So all these things is learned when you kind of like do the various programs, and you learn, oh, how should my storage account be secure? How should I deploy an environment to meet the cloud adoption framework? Things like this are the things you learn in the program, which by the time you're done learning it and you go into an environment, a production environment, a working environment, you say, oh, this is the way to do things, and I've found some loopholes. Other things you can do also as an engineer is automate the process. In Azure, there's something called an automation account, where, for example, you see how I would want to turn off services at a particular time. What if you forget to turn off the service? If it's a development environment or even a production environment that only serves people for a particular period of time, you can set automation rules to ensure that it turns off and comes on at a particular time. You can also do stuff like patching, monthly patching, where you ensure that every server in your environment is up to date, you know. So there are different things to do as a cloud engineer. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
All right.
Can
And
I ask a question? Well, my question is related to my former one. Well, I don't think that I make my question uh well I think that I should have to readdress my question actually.
okay.
It's because well in Google Cloud um well there is a cloud shell. So if you
Mm-hmm.
click the cloud shell, then we are connected to the Google Cloud servers.
Okay.
So we should be able to use the server system and then using the Linux commands. So we can control the servers. Um, and then these terraform files, we can go to in the cloud shell. We click the button of the open editor. So there in the editor, then we can see the directory that with our IDs in, which means that which we are allowed to use the space given by the Google Cloud server that we are connected to. Then there we can see or we make the files we needed, including the Terraform file. Then that's what we did. So that's my understanding of the Google Cloud Computing. But in here, uh, we have learned how to create the virtual machines and load balancing things, but we just jumped into the Terraform file, which you are opening to us and opened and to show us by using the Microsoft WebEx, right? Then my question is that where the hell is the let me use this word. Where did the files come from? Well,
All right. That's
how
good.
could we connect it to the Azure server or AWS server? Well, it seems like that there is something, you just jumped into something else. Then
Okay.
we are looking at the Terraform file. Terraform file is kind of, it's just my understanding. I'm also a beginner though.
Mm-hmm.
But the Terraform file, when I learned the Google Cloud Computing, then
Mm-hmm.
it's very straightforward. Oh, this is what we are going to do. So it's just a kind of definition of the systems or, like a network port and something like, or a password, a protocol. It's just very straightforward.
All
So
right.
how can the cloud shell
Mm-hmm.
from the Google Cloud Computing perspectives, where is the Google Cloud Shell, the open editor things, and how can
All
these
right.
Terraform
All right.
files are connected into the
Okay.
WebEx? So,
So first of all, you spoke about, the cloud shell.
yes.
All right. So if you go back to our Azure, there's also an Azure Cloud Shell, which when you enter your Azure Cloud Shell,
Uh-huh.
you see what it does. If you click on the Cloud Shell, it basically opens Welcome to Azure Cloud Shell. So you decide either you're going to write with Bash or with PowerShell. So if you're conversant with writing with PowerShell, which is um what most people are conversant with if you don't know how to use Linux or like Linux command. So you create storage. So every cloud shell has to have like a storage account that it saves its filing. Okay. So it saves its files to a storage account. So what it's doing now is creating a storage account. So next to when it's created, it opens your terminal. So instead of you going to a terminal outside of Azure, all right? You're already using a terminal that is mounted inside Azure is already aware of the directory, is already aware of your subscription, is already aware of you as a user. So now you get in here and start writing your commands in PowerShell. But remember, PowerShell commands are different from Terraform commands. They're not the same language, okay? Also, I mean, there are times when I've deployed things into Azure using the Cloud Shell that I didn't have to write the commands. You know, like you said, what we'll do is if you click this place here, you see it's upload or download files. So you can actually get files from your if I had a PowerShell file that I want to use to deploy an environment, all right, I will just click on upload and get one for my environment, and then initiate the command to create that virtual machine. Do you get? So that part is now infrastructure as code. That's not using the UI to start clicking this virtual machine load balancer, this and that. This is now doing everything from a command line interface, which is the Cloud Shell. All right. But for beginners, it's always important to first of all make them understand how the Azure how you actually navigate through the Azure portal. When we've solidified that step, we then go deeper into, you know, the infrastructure as code, which is using the Cloud Shell, connecting your environments, uploading your files and all that.
So
Okay.
Azure and AWS, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Azure and AWS uses the Terraform file only or JSON also?
Sorry, Terraform file or
JSON, JSON, JSON?
yeah, so every platform can use .json, it can use Terraform, it can use PowerShell, it can use normal CLI. Every platform can use it. It's just you have to put the right modules and push it to, because for the JSON, that's .json. You deploy it. That means you're going to deploy it using an ARM template.
Yes.
I feel like this conversation we're having is not on the level that everybody else understands. So I'm probably going to pause that.
Okay.
So yeah.
Later. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'll ask you later.
All right. This Terraform template, I know like it looks like a lot, like how do we get all these codes here? But if we were, doing a program, I would start with an empty file, and then we'll start to, write all these codes on creating a virtual network, creating subnet, and by the time you get how to do it, it's pretty like straightforward. You're basically just creating all the resources you need to deploy your environment. So that's that for today. I'm gonna stop presenting now and get any final questions before we stop. And I'm also gonna stop recording right now. All right.